On Question Time tonight, hot foot from the beauty contest in Blackpool, Francis Maude, chairman of the Conservative Party. The Minister for Europe, Douglas Alexander. The youngest MP in the House of Commons, Joe Swinson. And McElvoy of the Evening Standard. And there, to pepper things up a bit, the historian David Starkey. Join us for Question Time, as always, 10:35, BBC1, after the news.
Next tonight on BBC1, Question Time. Simon Sharma and P.D. James join Andrew Neil this week in an hour here on BBC1 after Question Time.
With me on Question Time tonight, Douglas Alexander, who attends Cabinet as Minister for Europe, Francis Maude, the chairman of the Conservative Party, Anne McElvoy, executive editor of the London Evening Standard, Joe Swinson, Liberal Democrat spokesman for the arts, and at 25, Britain's youngest MP, and Dr. David Starkey, historian and broadcaster. Good evening. Good evening from Manchester. Our panel, as always, try and guess what the questions are, but they don't know what they are until they're asked by our audience here. And if you want to have your say at home on what's being said, email us via our website, bbc.co.uk/questiontime, or text us during the programme on 83981. Call up CFAX page 155 to read what others have said. Our first question tonight comes from Liz Mosses.
If Norman Stanley Fletcher was still inside, should he be allowed to vote?
Francis Maude. Do any of you know who?
Yes, it was Ronnie Barker in Porridge.
Well done, got it in one.
Absolutely.
Ronnie Barker's character in Porridge, yes.
What a good question. I don't think so, actually. I mean, I'm sure he would have voted in a very sensible way. I wouldn't want to predict which way, but should people serving time in prison have the vote? No, I don't think so. I mean, I think you're taking time out as part of your, well, it is your punishment, and I think you do forego some of your rights, including your democratic right to vote. So, no, I don't think so.
This is in the light of a decision by the European Court of Human Rights that was announced this week, that somebody who'd been in jail for life for manslaughter said his human rights had been violated because under British law he wasn't allowed to have a vote, and they've said that this is a violation of his human rights. David Starkey.
I agree with Francis. It seems to me the idea of this universal human right is, which has been illustrated by the decision of the European Court, is profoundly dangerous. Sending somebody to jail is a fundamental deprivation of civil rights, and I think it should be extended. We do, after all, with certain types of criminals, deprive them of the right to property as well. If the property is thought to have been obtained by nefarious means, then that may be sequestrated. Similarly, I think that if you have sinned sufficiently to be sent to jail, and nowadays it's on the whole very difficult to get sent to jail for any period of time, then I think the broad raft of civil rights should be sacrificed, should be lost. And we don't want Europe interfering in the matter.
Man in the second row there, you say.
Prison's not just a punishment, though, it's a rehabilitation, and people are meant to leave prison and want to be part of society. If they're excluded from society in every way, maybe they'll never want to join society again.
And you'd say voting was part of it, yeah? Anne McElvoy.
Well, I also take the view that prisoners, on the whole, should be allowed to vote. One of my main problems is that, with the exception of very few people who are going to be in prison for extremely long periods and possibly life, that they do have to come out in society and they do have to be rehabilitated. And I think the idea that they are cut off from the democratic process does no good at all. After all, it's not that we're offering a huge privilege here. We're merely saying that you exercise your responsibility as a citizen, even if you are in prison. I think, but there are perhaps some exceptions in terms of how far you would extend that, or whether the serial killer who's in for life should be allowed to vote. I don't know, but I think as a principle, we should start from the position that you are allowed the vote unless the circumstances seem so obvious that you shouldn't.
Okay. The man in the blue shirt there.
So the panel, When did justice die in this country? And is the European Court of Human Rights independent from national governments?
All right, Douglas Alexander.
Well, no, we passed the Human Rights Act here in the Westminster Parliament, which is why the government has said, in light of this ruling from the European Court, we will urgently review the legislation. But to answer the original question on Norman Stanley Fletcher, I think one of the key principles would be the length of his sentence, in the sense that what already we've said since this ruling was made, that we do continue to believe that the long-standing principle of British justice, whereby if you are incarcerated in prison, you lose your right to the vote, is one which we will need to think very long and hard about in the context of this review. I think probably where we will move towards will be having categories of prisoners. So, for example, the serial killer that Anne talked about is clearly in a different category from somebody who finds themselves in jail for a couple of weeks.
But this was a man who had a life sentence for manslaughter.
Yes,
and the court has said he's entitled to vote. And your Lord Chancellor says, oh, well, they're not really saying that. They're just saying, you know, consider carefully the basis of your law.
Well,
but he's been given the right to vote.
No, but actually the judgment said that the blanket ban on all prisoners, I think there are about 70,000 prisoners in Britain at the moment, was not justifiable as far as the European Court was concerned. There are other countries who are bound by the European Court who do remove the right to vote from prisoners. So in that sense, it's not saying in no circumstances can somebody who's been incarcerated lose the right to vote. It's simply we're going to have to review whether there is a less blunt instrument than what's been the approach, I think, since the Representation of the People Act in 1983.
Do prisoners vote Labour or Tory, in your view?
They don't vote at all.
They don't vote at all.
No, but when they get the vote?
I think it depends on how rehabilitated they've become.
Joe Swinson.
I think the gentleman down here hit the nail on the head. It is about rehabilitating people who are in prison so that when they come out, they can actually act as responsible citizens. At the moment, nearly 3 in 5 of prisoners who come out reoffend within 2 years. Now, that situation does none of us any good. And there obviously needs to be a whole raft of measures that we have in place within our prisons to rehabilitate people. And giving them the right to vote is just part of that. And it's common practice in most other European countries. So I'm very glad this ruling has come through.
OK. And the woman on the right there, if we can reach her, which I think we can.
When a judge has already decided that a person's committed a crime of such magnitude that they need to be taken out of society, why on earth should they be afforded the right to have a say in how that society is governed?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Would the less blunt instrument be allowing prisoners to vote when their release is imminent?
Right, just a rehabilitation, in other words. And the woman too to your right.
Those who say that prisoners should not be allowed to vote, would they say that that was every prisoner, so including the pensioners who've refused to pay the council tax and have been imprisoned for non-payment? Would they not be allowed to vote if a general election was held on that day? I think all prisoners should be allowed to vote, actually.
Right, OK. Let's go on. We'll go on to another question now from Mark Todd, please. Mark Todd.
Should the Conservative Party stop apologising for its past?
David Starkey.
Yes, it should stop. It seems to me the reason that this country ceased to be a basket case in 1979, which the then old Labour government reduced it to, is entirely due to Margaret Thatcher. That's point one. Point two, the reason that New Labour has governed with a modicum of success is because it is in every important instance continued the policies of the major government, from Northern Ireland to the approach to interest rates and how they are targeted and so on. In other words, there is a very considerable amount to boast about. And the Tories will never recover until they reconnect with their own past and stop cringing. Things have to change, but the pride of the achievement of that government, which is so great that Tony Blair, remember, one of the first people he invited into Downing Street was Margaret Thatcher. And in all key areas, she has been his goal, his idol, his target, his example.
It's an interesting question, Mark. Should they stop apologising for their past? Well, on my reckoning, they've got an awful lot to apologise for. Whether they've done enough of that yet, I'm not quite sure. I think it's actually been quite an interesting week at this Tory party conference, and I have to confess that much as I am now an MP, I don't normally find the party conference season in the other parties particularly scintillating. But I've been quite interested in watching the beauty parade of the various leadership candidates. And actually, I do hope that the Tories can become a healthy party, because actually that is much better for all of us within democracy.
What's a healthy party?
Oh, I think a party that can actually connect with people within the country. I think a problem the Conservatives have had in the past is that they have been trying to talk to people, but people have just been not listening or not willing to hear and understand what they're trying to say.
Rather more on the whole connect with what the Tories are saying than with Liberal, don't they, if you look at the numbers of voters? Or don't they matter? They're not in jail, so they don't count, is it?
Well, I think it depends who you look at. If you look at young people, for example, there's more people voting Lib Dem than Conservative.
I just count. It's really boring, but I just count the number of votes. Sorry.
Okay. Well, it was one of the candidates, David Davis, who said, let's stop apologising, after you, Francis Maude, had said, we're stuck in the past, and people see us as for the well-off and not the have-nots and all that. Were you apologising?
No, not a bit. All I was doing to the conference was pointing out what people think of us, which seems to be a reasonably intelligent place to start. What I would want to apologise for is that we haven't succeeded in winning any of the last 3 elections. But we sometimes go on as if we're expecting the electorate to apologise to us, and that doesn't seem to me very realistic. The electorate don't particularly regret the decision they took. And as a sensible, serious party that wishes to earn the right to serve our country in government, we ought to find out what people think. And we're doing that. The evidence is pretty clear. All I did was say, people do think the Tories are stuck in the past. People do think we're opportunistic. And we need to understand that the values that people see in us are not the values that we as Conservatives see in ourselves.
So what did
we need to cure that. Understanding the problem is the first step towards curing it.
What did the man who was until this morning the front runner, maybe still is the front runner for the leadership, David Davis, mean when he said, let's stop apologising?
I don't know, you'd have to ask him. But I'm not conscious that anyone is apologising for what we've done. The Tory government ceased to be in government 8 years ago. And it seems to me of little importance for the electorate, who are concerned about what's coming rather than what's in the past, to endlessly argue over the rights and wrongs of what was done. I think most of what we did was good. We didn't get everything right. So what? What I'm concerned about is what are the challenges that Britain faces today and tomorrow? How can the Conservative Party connect properly with people and get from 33% of the vote, which is what we got in May of this year, to something like 43%, which is when we'll be able to get rid of what will by then be Gordon Brown and put in place a Conservative government which has intelligent, serious, principled solutions to the problems that Britain will face.
All right.
And that seems to me a perfectly reasonable thing for us to try to do.
Mark Todd, what do you think?
I think that the public see you as opportunistic and stuck in the past because you are.
But then do you think they should apologise for the past?
I'm really enjoying them apologising, and I can't get enough of it. It's fantastic.
So your answer to your own question is no, they shouldn't stop apologising.
No,
they should
keep
go on.
apologising and keep it going. It's great TV.
The woman here in the second row.
You're talking about connecting and appealing to the mainstream society, but then what do you make of comments made by, say, Anne Winterton last week, where she said, in reference to 7/7, that thank God, thankfully we're a predominantly white Christian society, and maybe this is the price we are paying, and by we I'm presuming she doesn't include people like me, we are paying for being a multicultural society. How on earth do you expect to engage with mainstream society when, Britain is such a multicultural society?
I profoundly disagree with Anne Winterton. I think she was very wrong to say what she did. I don't have a problem at all. I relish the fact that Britain is very diverse. We are, after all, a country where all of us come from immigrant stock. When people go on about Anglo-Saxon traditions, they they forget that both the Angles and the Saxons were, if you go back far enough, immigrants. Our culture has been completely informed by immigration over the centuries.
Okay,
and I relish the contribution that immigration has made to our culture and hugely to our economy.
Let's go back to apologising for the past. Douglas Alexander, what's your view?
Well, you're sounding a bit like you're stuck in the past, David.
No, it's the question that he asked.
Let me answer. If you represent a constituency like mine that was blighted by unemployment in the early 1980s, that's why I joined the Labour Party in the first place, then it does take you a long time to believe the Tory party has moved on from an attitude that says unemployment is a price worth paying or there is no such thing as society. It will frankly take a long time. I think the risk for the Tory party this week is they're perpetuating the same analysis which they've had really for the last 8 years, which wasn't that they were in the wrong in 1997, but somehow the British people were in the wrong because they threw them out. And ultimately, I think that's why Michael Howard made his final speech today as leader, because if you really look at what his vision is of Britain, it was to take Britain back to where we were 10 years ago, rather than actually be comfortable with what Britain could be like 10 years into the future. And ultimately in politics, I don't think it matters, with the greatest respect, Francis, whether you wear a tie, whether you stand at a lectern or not. What matters is what you stand for. And I've seen perilously little evidence that the Conservative Party actually know what they stand for beyond the kind of values they've always stood for.
David Cameron, you include in that?
I would include David Cameron. David Cameron
is a sort of new face for the Tory party, or
you can't
the chairman of the party himself.
But in politics, you can't will the ends without willing the means. David Cameron voted against the expenditure to increase funding for our National Health Service. Francis Hughes, Shadow Chancellor, predicted a recession in 1998.
I didn't.
Voted. Well,
I predicted a downturn, which happened. I predicted a manufacturing recession, which also happened.
How did you vote on the minimum wage?
I can't remember when it was. When was it?
Well, that tells its own story.
Well, you can play this game either way. Let's just hear. I want to hear from the woman there, and then come to McElvoy. Yes.
If the sorry, me.
Yes, you.
If the Tory party is so diverse, why don't they have a young female Asian Muslim candidate in the Tory leadership contest?
Well, because we don't have one in the House of Commons, so there's no one eligible. But what we do have is a young female Asian vice chairman of the party appointed by me a couple of months ago, who is very, very talented, who fought a marginal seat at the last election, sadly didn't get elected, but I'm absolutely certain she will get selected and elected into the next Parliament.
Anne McElvoy.
Well, I think that the lady raises a very good point, because when, having spent the week in Blackpool with the Conservatives, and it was a very stimulating week and a very interesting parade of new ideas about the future, but still it is culturally like being in a bit of a bubble. And, you know, with due respect to what Francis has just said, I seem to, you know, for many years have sat next to very enlightened, intelligent Conservatives telling me that the next time there were going to be this fantastic change of candidates, and they were all going to look like modern Britain. But funnily enough, when you go back to the Conservative Party, it doesn't quite look like that. Now, I do think, in all fairness, that this week may be the beginning of a sea change there. Really, there weren't many people harking back to the past, at least not as much as was the case, I think, in previous recent party conferences. So I think a lot of the candidates, whatever their views, have tumbled to the fact that they need to look like they embrace the Britain that we live in now, not a sort of nostalgia tour for the Britain that they lost when Mrs. Thatcher fell.
I think all this is a necessary condition for the rehabilitation of the Tories. And you might have asked, for example, why won't the next Labour Prime Minister, why will he be white and male and Scottish, you know, rather than the interesting combination you suggested. But the key why the Tories look so awful at the moment is that the Labour Party, New Labour, Blair, stole all their clothes. Who would imagine that you have a Labour government going for foundation hospitals, a Labour government continuing marketisation policies in the health service, a Labour government going for a complete break-up of, to use Alistair Campbell, that well-known Labour figure's phrase, bog-standard comprehensives. At every single point, Blair is trying to introduce neo-Thatcherite methods into government. That's why the Tories are helpless. But of course, unless you got a little nice young little apparatchik like Douglas here, members of the Labour Party don't like it. The instinct of the Labour Party is against Blair. The tactic of the Tories should be doing what they've never yet dared to do, which is enthusiastically vote with the government for foundation hospitals, enthusiastically vote with the government for university fees.
All right.
And
That's
that
enough.
way, even Douglas would vomit in the lobby and say no. David wants to I need points.
No, you come back later in there. I'm sorry. Douglas Alexander.
David, let me try and elevate the quality of the debate by asking Francis
What
a
was wrong
genuine
with it?
question. Let me ask a genuine question,
Stop
which is
patronising, you little twit.
How is it different? How is it different this week when you have Conservative leaders saying they want a modern, compassionate form of conservatism than what we actually heard from William Hague initially, what we then heard from Ian Duncan Smith was his concern for the vulnerable, and what actually we heard in the first speech that Michael Howard made as leader of the Conservative Party? Why should we believe the Conservative Party is changing now when it hasn't changed in recent years?
Well, Douglas, you are a bit stuck in the past. But, I mean, I'll take that absolutely head on, and the answer is you shouldn't believe it until we do it. I mean, I'm not going to just say we're going to change. We will have to show that we're changing, and I think we are going to do that.
The man there in the third row down.
Shouldn't the Tory party...
Come on, can we hold on a second? Yeah, OK.
Shouldn't the Tory party apologise for being such a poor opposition in the last 8 years?
OK, and if we can reach him, the man up there.
Thanks. I seem to remember the last Conservative government having a number of recessions, having interest rates at 15%, and when they were in opposition opposing the minimum wage and opposing a lot of progressive measures, investment in the health service and education. If David Davis really doesn't think that you should be apologising for that, then you haven't learnt the lessons.
OK. We'll go on to another question. I'm not sure calling another panellist a little twit is question time language.
When he's invited to comment on what I've said and he turns his back, when he's commenting on people going back to the past and he deliberately avoids the substantive point that I'd made and goes back to Francis's, I think the term little twit was moderate, considered, careful and fully justified, and exactly what you expect from a new Labour minister.
Richard Allen, a question from you, please.
Have this year's party conferences done anything to improve the perception of any particular politician or political party?
OK, let's just briefly widen this thing out. Have the party conferences done anything to improve perceptions? Jo Swinson.
Well, I would like to hope so, although I'm not necessarily sure that they have. I think one thing that certainly struck me from the Liberal Democrat conference this year, and I think, to be fair, has also been true of the Conservatives, is actually there's been some genuine debate. And obviously, immediately after a general election is an ideal time to do that. There's less of the pressure that is on a party immediately before the election. And while when a party is going through that process, then the media don't always look on it kindly and don't always get the headlines that you want, I think actually that process in itself is very valuable. And for the people that were in Blackpool 3 weeks ago at the Lib Dem conference, we all felt like we were really able to participate in some interesting, exciting debates.
Richard Allen, what do you think?
I think David Cameron's obviously come out of it very well. He's put himself forward as being one of the potential leaders of the party.
That's one person out of... That's it, just him?
David Davis has struggled a bit with his speech as well. But it might be too soon for David Cameron to come and lead the party. It might be too soon for somebody that young.
Your question was about conferences in general, so let's stick with that. Anne McElvoy.
Well, I think that there always are winners and losers from each conference, as little as politicians sometimes like to confront it until they get home and look in the mirror and think, oh, did we really do that? So what I would say, having looked at all three of them in my professional capacity, as the doctors would say, with the Lib Dems, I'm afraid I think Charlie Kennedy did not come out of it looking like as strong a leader as he ought to be if he intends to carry on leading the party. He did look rather more like the chairman than the leader, and I think that's a real problem for the Lib Dems. I thought that Blair had a very good Labour conference, given that they went into it as usual in the traditional yearly wrestling match with the Chancellor about when he was going to take over as leader. However, I'll have to say, Douglas, in terms of PR, you know, next time, can you just let the 82-year-old pensioner finish the point? For the Tories, there was one darling of the conference, regardless of whether we think that he will go all the way or whether he's fully formed. It was David Cameron. It was an absolutely stunning debut, and he has a great future in the Conservative Party.
Douglas Alexander.
I'll make no defence of the 82-year-old individual. It was wrong, it shouldn't have happened, and I was ashamed when I saw the pictures on the television. I don't think any of the main parties can take that much comfort out of these conferences. Partly because I think when you're at the conferences, you do live in this rather curious bubble, and if you're part of politics at Westminster, then you're inclined to watch the speeches that David Cameron or David Davis or other people make. I think most people who are getting on with their lives, frankly, connect very little with the speeches that are being made in conferences. We're in a Society today, where the 4 largest development charities all have more members than all 3 of our political parties put together. And in that sense, I do think one of the things we need to rethink is how we do party conferences so that they aren't exclusive events which are largely watched by journalists and politicians, but actually are something which is a forum in which we can have a serious discussion about the serious issues we face as a country.
Francis Maude?
Well, I agree with Douglas's last point, and you know, there's a whole wider issue about how do we re-engage people generally with party politics, because there is an alienation from them. In terms of who benefits from party, well, I think Mr. Wolfgang, his profile developed very considerably during the Labour Party conference. There've been lots of jokes about all that, but actually what was rather shocking in all of that was that the poor fellow was marched out by these goons and then arrested under prevention of terrorism legislation, which ministers had just assured us would never be used in order to stop peaceful protests. And they're in the very heart of the Labour Party's own forum. That happened. On the broader point, I mean, I think one of the things about our conference, and actually everyone who was at our conference, all the journalists told me, even the most hard-bitten, Anne's not at all hard-bitten and cynical, but there were lots, there are some journalists do become that. You'll find it hard to believe, I know, but it does happen. The most hard-bitten of them said this was a really interesting conference. Now, normally when journalists tell me they've enjoyed a Conservative Party conference, it's for the very worst of reasons. It's because we got something horribly wrong. This time they enjoyed it because they said it was very open, very forward-looking, interesting ideas developing, and obviously we set it up so that the potential leadership contenders would have the opportunity to present themselves.
And not success?
Yes, it was.
Good
very
for
much
David
so.
Davis?
Well, I mean, I can't. I'm institutionally neutral. I can't make any comment on any individual candidates. But it wasn't just presenting them to the party because they are visible to the public. And I think one of the things that is really important for the Conservative Party as we go into this leadership election is not just to think about what suits us as the Conservative Party. Sometimes selecting a leader is a bit like sort of gaining entry to a Jesuit seminary. You have to sort of match their doctrinal purity. We need a leader who will have very broad popular appeal. I have no idea which one that will turn out to be, but there's time now for that to be seriously explored.
I think it's much better to see debate at a party conference than the sinister and disgusting events that I saw at the Labour Party conference, and that's coming from a former Labour Party member. I probably will never join your party again after what I saw happen to Mr. Wolfgang. It was disgusting.
David Starkey.
Absolutely. I think the comment from the floor that we've just heard is right. And we had, again, Douglas here prattling away on how we need to get people reconnecting with politics. And what we saw in the Labour Party conference was a display of total manipulative, cynical politics, with, of course, fundamental differences hardly masked between Blair and Brown, and above all, the sense that there was lies, and more lies. New Labour is an enormously large institutional lie. That's what it's there for. Now, until that lie is exposed, and it is the duty of the opposition, and it is their failure to expose the lie, which is why they should be apologising, until that lie is exposed, party politics mean almost nothing. You are faced with a choice of 2 post-Thatcherite parties, and even the Liberals with Vince Cable rapidly trying to go in that direction too. We're in a post-Thatcherite universe. There is no real choice. Why bother? I think that is thoroughly, totally unhealthy. And the patron saint of this rotten politics is Peter Mandelson.
Okay. Well, and that's Sally. We'll go on to another question. Just before we do, question time's whereabouts. We're going to be in Stanley in County Durham next week, and the week after that, that's October the 20th on Thursday, we're going to be in Birmingham. Stanley and then Birmingham. If you want to come, please do. 090 11 114 411, or you can always apply via our website, bbc.co.uk/question time. You can also comment on tonight's programme there, and if you've got broadband, you can now watch the whole glorious thing again, or if you missed a bit or want to catch up on whether Dr. Starkey really did say what he said, You can find it there. I'm told it now goes very smoothly through. It used to be a bit sort of jerky. And you can text us, of course, as ever, 83981 for your rude comments, and 155 on CFAX to see what you and others have said. Let's go to our next question from Stephen Parry, please. Mr. Parry.
Is the expansion of Europe to include Turkey a step too far?
Is it a step too far? Do you want to just explain why you think it might be?
Well, I think that Europe's probably unwieldy enough as it is, let alone letting in another large country with another large population.
Okay. Well, Douglas Alexander, you were deeply involved in all that, but don't go through all the negotiations, but just give your view, if you would, on that question.
No, I certainly don't believe it's a step too far. I think it's a step in the right direction. I think if you look at the strategic challenges we face in Europe, many of them will be assisted by the membership of Turkey, what will be many years down the line, whether that is the challenge of dealing with terrorism, whether it's the challenge of dealing with people trafficking or drugs, or whether it's just a recognition that in and of itself it would send out a tremendously positive signal to have a large, secular, democratic Muslim country predominantly Muslim country within the European Union. I think at a stroke it would challenge the notion that there is somehow an inevitable clash of civilizations between the West and Islamic culture, and instead suggest that there is a way that we can work in partnership in the years ahead.
You think it's going to happen?
I do believe, I certainly hope it will happen. There are very strict criteria which will have to be met. There's about 35 chapters, as they're called, that Turkey will have to meet, and we've already said we would expect it would take upwards of a decade. But do I believe that it's the right destination for Europe and the right journey? Certainly.
Okay. Anne McElvoy.
I think it would be a great risk not to have the potential for Turkish accession because here we are, a large, populous country in an extremely important strategic position bordering Iran, Iraq and Syria, which actively wants to be part of the West, wants to come towards Europe, and a Muslim country that wants to come towards us. In the present climate, I think we would be absolutely mad not to take that on board. And the price of letting Turkey cutting Turkey out, letting it float free when there are many, many attempts inside the country and outside it to destabilise it and to turn it against the West as a fundamentalist state rather than a mildly progressive secular state are already underway, and we mustn't lose sight of that.
What do you make of the opposition in Europe to it? Because a majority of people in Europe are against it. The French and the Austrians are going to give referendums on whether Turkey should be allowed in, which could be a start. Why do you think there's this hostility?
Well, I think we know why there's this hostility, because
well,
it's a big Muslim state. It is a very big step for the EU, but look, the EU has to change. The EU cannot go on being this inward-looking, protectionist club, often discussing things which are really not the most important things going on in the world today. Now, Turkey is a long way down the line before it does come in. There are, as Douglas says, many tests that it still has to pass, and I would just say to the British government, one thing that we really have to be very vigilant and vocal about is the Turkish human rights record. And I think if there was any sense that that was being given a free pass, I'm thinking particularly the recent arrest of a famous Turkish writer, freedom of expression and basic liberties, we have to stand up for those even as we support the accession.
The man there.
But surely bringing all the cheap labour in from Turkey into the EU, it will take jobs away from what, I hate to say it, but rightly belong to the British people.
Joe Swinson, you answer that point?
Well, I mean, you could equally argue that with the recent events we've seen with the Chinese manufacturing, that the jobs have been going out of Europe in any case. So I don't think you can necessarily stop, when you're living in a global economy, you can't necessarily stop jobs going to places where labour is cheaper. I think there are huge advantages in Turkey becoming a member of the EU in good time, and I agree with a lot of what Anne said, because actually what you see here is the EU and Europe acting as a force for extending democracy and human rights, and there's already been some steps taken in that direction by Turkey, even just through the run-up to becoming, starting the talks even. And indeed with the other countries in Eastern Europe and the countries like Romania and Bulgaria looking forward to joining. In those countries you've got huge impetus to try and stamp out corruption. And that means actually the EU can be a hugely powerful force. And if we're thinking within the global context, there's lots of different attitudes of what routes we could take to influence other countries. And I certainly think that it's far best to go down this kind of route of diplomacy.
Okay. Yep.
After our earlier discussion on the rights of British prisoners and
to vote, what rights do you think the Turkish prisoners will have to vote?
David Starkey.
I hate to agree with Douglas, but I do. It seems to me that there are two very good reasons why we want Turkey in. The first is what it will do to Europe. You used a phrase like a step too far. It's a step too far for a narrow, restrictive, super-state idea of Europe. It will mean that Europe will go back to what I voted for in the referendum. It will be essentially a free market Europe, which is a thoroughly good thing. And the second is, Turkey has always been part of Europe. It's not an Asiatic state. Its capital was Constantinople. It's a successor state of Rome. You know, the core of our civilization is there. So in one sense, it's redressing a historical wrong. And there's another really interesting point, Anne, about Austria. Why is Austria leading the opposition? It's not simply because of the fear of immigrants and its own highly dubious track record on many issues. It is, of course, that Austria, under the Habsburgs, was the great enemy of Turkey. And again, one of the things I'm loving about the new Europe, it's straight back to medieval history. Why are we spending all our time quarrelling with the French? Because that is what the English always did. And Europe provides for that. And the Austrians are reconstituting their empire, which is why they're sponsoring Croatia as a part of their Balkan Empire. They're sponsoring Croatia. And, of course, they're opposing Turkey because the Turks were only turned back from the gates of Vienna in the late 17th century.
And of course, when they got the news about Croatia, they dropped their opposition to the Turkish.
So the new Europe is straight back to the Middle Ages. I love it.
There's one other point. President Chirac says there has to be a major cultural revolution in Turkey before she can come in. Do you agree with that, Francis Maude?
So say again.
Chirac says there has to be a major cultural revolution in Turkey. In other words, it's in no way fit to join.
Means they've got to go back to speaking French again. At least they're upper class.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's the real concern in reality. The fact is that I think Chirac and to some extent the German politicians are actually looking for excuses to keep Turkey out, and I don't think there's real substance in that. I love David Starkey's historical analysis. I recall that I sat at his feet when I was at university learning history from him.
Not enough.
Well, I learned everything I know from you, David. It's very boring if we all agree, but we do, and I think it is not only not a step too far. I think Europe can handle this. I absolutely think it must, because I think the risks of us not doing so are huge. Just the point about will it create a flood of cheap labour, that's been suggested before every enlargement of the European Union. When Greece came in, Spain and Portugal, all the Eastern European and Central European countries, and actually it hasn't happened.
So it'll get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, will it?
Well, I didn't say why shouldn't Well, David, I would like to see there being urgent steps taken to engage Ukraine in a process of potential accession. Ukraine has just, in the last year, managed to secure itself a democratically elected government against the wishes, let's face it, of the Russian government. And I think it's incredibly important for us, for the world, that steps should be taken to encourage Ukraine to come into the family of Western liberal democratic nations.
All right.
I believe that Turkey should be given this opportunity to join the EU, and also because of what they have to do, you know, to join it, that we know we have to go through that. But at the end of the day, there seems to be a big worry from people that I speak to, that there will be concessions made to them. I know that's not the case, but I think that's what people believe, that in some way they won't be able to meet this criteria to join. I believe they will, and I believe, you know, because the willingness to join, they will have to meet that criteria.
And thank you. And the man in blue shirt there.
Oh, sorry. Size matters. The world is dividing up into large trade blocks, and I think Europe is constrained by its borders at present. And when you talk about strategic value, Turkey is strategically important.
You're in favour?
I'll pass on that one if you don't mind. But basically, the world is dividing up into large trade blocks, and the EU's worried.
The man there foreign, you say?
Given our continent's history, is it right to let a country in that continues to deny genocide?
Douglas Alexander. Well, the Armenian...
Yeah, there's been demonstrations in recent days in Turkey over this issue. It wasn't a precondition of opening accession talks, but if you look at the changes that have taken place to the penal code in Turkey, you look at civil society and the ability to talk about these issues, Of course, there is an awful lot further that Turkey has to go. Those of us who want to see Turkey being part of the European Union recognise that in many ways the journey is as important as the destination. Anne was right to identify one of its leading novelists wrote an article in a newspaper in Switzerland and found themselves still charged in court. It's essential that the European Union is a magnet drawing a country towards greater human rights and greater democracy. And that's where I'm cautious in doing this, but I take issue with David's characterisation of the future of Europe as being solely a free market area, because I've recently just returned from visits to the Balkans. These are countries which even just a decade ago were often mired in ethnic conflict and civil war. It is just the fact that they have the prospect of European Union membership, albeit down the line, that is helping drag those countries towards a future of normality or modernity. And in that sense, I think we need to recognise how powerful a driver the European Union continues to be for the kind of changes in other countries which will actually benefit Britain's interest in years to come.
Okay. A brief point from the gentleman in spectacles there, and then I want to move on. Yes.
I think it is important that we assist Turkey in joining the European Union because we promised them the opportunity of doing that. But what's most concerning is the fact that a lot of these major European countries, such as France, Germany and Austria, are not resisting their application on some economic grounds, but because they've got a large Muslim population. What sort of message does that send to the Islamic world that we're trying to court at this moment in time?
Okay. Well, the answer is...
All right, this one. The woman in the green dress.
Can I say something very brief? I've actually been to Turkey, and it's not, I mean, it was years ago, but I mean, it was a country where when men walked into the room, all the girls had to stand up, the girls couldn't read. We're Kurdish, so we stayed with Kurdish families who couldn't speak Kurdish, you know, that language was banned in Turkey. I mean, it's not... Obviously, you know, there's lots of reasons, but I think the human rights record in Turkey is something that obviously you've touched upon, and with the genocide, you know, with the Armenian people. But I think it's
But if you want to make it better, don't you think you have a better chance to influence it for the good by engaging Turkey rather than pushing it out of the doctrine?
Okay. All right, let's go on. This is another question from Heather Burnett, or Burnett.
Would the panel prefer tomorrow to be mainly dry or for there to be patchy rain?
The Meteorological Office apparently doesn't like the way the BBC people say it, and they say you should, instead of saying things like that in chilly and isolated areas, you should say it's warm for most. David Starkey.
I think this is clearly the new Labourisation of weather forecasts. Soon it will be a crime punishable by being sent to jail, probably with withdrawal of the vote, certainly if you intended to vote Conservative, to suggest that the weather tomorrow will be anything but sunny so long as a new Labour government remains in office.
Douglas Alexander.
My principal objection to the weather, I have to say, is the new angle of the weather map, because you can hardly see my constituency, so that's more of a concern to me than how they actually describe the showers or the sun.
Scotland at all, yes, they said, didn't they? They've changed that a bit now. Jo Swinson, you're also a Scot.
I am indeed, and while I might prefer the weather tomorrow to be mainly dry, living as I do in the west of Scotland, I think it's much more likely to be patchy rain.
And what will it be in Manchester? Manchester was one of the ones mentioned, wasn't it? That Manchester is always... Remember what they said? When it's foggy and wet in Manchester, they should be saying it's dry on the M62 or something. Francis Maude?
Well, it's all a bit risible, really, isn't it? I mean, it's absurd.
Like Labour, yes.
It's absolutely absurd. I mean, we all know what they mean. Who is being given offence by this? Well, it seems to me a completely ridiculous notion.
Anne McElvoy.
I think I'm going to be the only optimist on the panel. You know, I go through the weather sites when it gets towards the weekend and I'm thinking of escaping the office, and if there's one that says it's too showery, I look at another one in the hope that it'll have some sun on it. So, come on, you know, sporadic showers. Let's look on the bright side and hope that the sun shines. I think most people would rather watch the weather forecast in that spirit rather than looking for the rain.
The Met Office said one of the
Especially
problems...
Manchester.
One of the problems is understanding what a weather forecaster is trying to tell you. I don't know. OK, let's go on. We've got a question from Mohammed Javid, please.
Why did a cancer patient have to wait so long in order to get a potentially life-saving drug?
This is the case of Barbara Clark, who won a battle to get Herceptin on the National Health Service for breast cancer. Anne McElvoy.
I think it really did expose some genuinely difficult choices about the NHS and about treatment, because more treatments are coming on stream and many of them are very expensive, and they're expensive because a lot of research and development goes into them. And in the case of Herceptin, I mean, this was a drug that's still in trials, in some places approved in others. I perfectly understood why this lady took her case on. I thought it was very odd that the judgment seemed to hinge on the fact that she was looking after a child who otherwise would have nowhere to go. I mean, either the drug is going to be available on the NHS or it isn't. It seems very odd that we're living in a sort of system in which that sort of judgment can be made on a specific case about something that's nothing to do with her illness. The only thing that when I tried to read into it that I could work out that looked like it needed to be changed was that the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, another grand New Labour quangro brought in, I think, just after 1997, which came in with a very sensible idea of saying which drugs work, which are good value, and that we don't waste money on drugs, has turned into a sort of regulatory, bureaucratic nightmare in which the delay in actually approving drugs which are thought to be safe elsewhere seems to be unconscionably long, and this may be just such a case.
Joe Swinson.
Well, I think in answer to the question why she had to wait so long, it is to do with the amount of time it takes for drugs to be licensed and then approved by NICE. And there's actually various drugs which are still awaiting this process. And I think the wait is too long and needs to be speeded up. But not just for Herceptin. There's a general problem here that there is too long of a wait. And I think one of the wider issues that this actually highlights is why did we have to wait until Barbara Clark takes this case to court for Patricia Hewitt to actually make an announcement, to actually make sure that Herceptin will actually be prioritised once the licensing process is done? Why do we have to wait for a media headline or a PR disaster for the government for action to be taken?
What a silly question.
Well, I don't think it's very healthy to have government by media headline, and I would like to think...
Where have you been living? You are 25, for God's sake.
I'm still an optimist, though, and I think it would be much more healthy if government set policy by looking at the facts. I mean, another example is the Jamie school dinners. You know, why did the government need Jamie Oliver to tell them
Dear,
there's a
you're
problem
too
with
sweet to be let in
meals?
the House of Commons.
Francis Maude.
Well, I don't know the detail of why it took so long. There clearly is an agonising situation. If you've got a dreadful illness like that, and you know there's a drug that might make your life better, or save your life, perhaps, and actually there's a process that just grinds on, and should there be a swifter process for testing and licensing, as long as it's safe and reliable? We know there have been problems with some drugs which have been released too quickly and have caused themselves problems.
And
I think the process
cost
here, well, I think the process here is actually about rationing and the sort of bureaucracy that Anne rightly refers to is actually about rationing demand. It is about cost control. But, I mean, there are huge amounts of bureaucracies being created. NICE is only but one of them. There's huge amounts more spending going into the health service, for sure. But in my area, the hospitals are actually having people, you know, used to complain about how long you spent on a trolley. And our hospital is how long you have to wait before you get onto a trolley. They're stacked up in...